My name's Damian Hine. I'm at UQ Business School. I'm an associate professor at the UQ Business School, and my work tends to focus very much around change. So I'm what's called an evolutionary economist, which means that I analyse, particularly at a firm or a business or an organisational level, changes in those organisations. The thing that drives a lot of change in organisations is technology and technological development. What area is there a huge amount of technological development? It is in biotechnology, pharmaceuticals and that. So I've worked in this space for probably the last 20 years, bringing an economic perspective to the science. And so I tend to work very much in multidisciplinary teams with scientists, with economists, with policymakers and other people like that, because it's a very complex field and no one person really has all the solutions themselves. So when we're looking at the therapeutics, we're really looking at the implications of genomics research and science, and it's really looking at drugs, vaccines in particular. So it does lead us into the pharmacogenomics and pharmacogenetics. When we look at pharmacogenomics, we're looking at the whole genome mapping, and we're looking at the association between biomarkers in a person's genome. So we're looking at mutations, and this then allows us to target solutions, and particularly therapeutics, much more effectively. So it is really a disruptive technology that we're dealing with here, and that has big implications for not only policy, but on society as well, because we have to look at the ethics of that. We need to actually look at the responses of society to this really quite dramatic movement forward in pharmaceuticals, drugs and therapeutic solutions to diseases. So pharmacogenetics is, you might say, somewhat of a narrower focus. So when we're talking about genetics, we're not talking about the whole genome. We're talking about looking at genetic, and it can be genetic mutations, but we can look at heredity, and we can look at particular features around the genetic traits of an individual or a group of people, so say through ethnicity. So precision medicines are really enabled by genomics and genetics, and the pharmaco, of course, is the drug side of that. So we're looking at therapeutics, drugs, vaccines in particular, but there are other areas, but this is my concentration stream, which is the therapeutic stream. And precision medicines are really the medicines which are enabled by the better targeting and identification, particularly of mutations in a person's genetic traits and in their genome. So that increased targeting allows us then to actually look at individuals rather than large groups of people in society or large groups of patients. So we're seeing a greater and greater targeting to the specific causes of diseases, and the ultimate goal in a way is seen to be what are called N of 1 trials. So a trial of a drug, say, for a solution for one individual, their own disease and the specific mutations that cause that. So that's the precision medicine side of things, which is built around really the breakthrough technological developments around genomics. I think that one of the key aspects, which is a plus and a minus, is complexity. So it's the complexity of the science, it's the complexity of the genome, it's the complexity of coming up with solutions and whether those solutions are going to work. Then that complexity rolls into the societal responses, and it can also have really big issues around policy and especially around regulation. So the regulatory framework for, say, drug development has been around for a very long time. It's gone through some changes, but it really has a 100-year history. So it's quite difficult for regulation to keep pace with technology at the pace that it's changing. And that can be a restriction, and has been, but there's moves afoot, a lot of moves afoot in terms of making sure that the regulatory framework is brought up to speed with the technology. So we're seeing a lot of adaptive trials, we're seeing smaller trials, we're seeing much more focus. And so what is important about that is that we're seeing the smaller trial size, and when we're seeing that, we're again seeing that targeting, that precision is starting to come in. It doesn't solve all problems, and there are really big issues around anything around genomics. That word precision medicine is a very debatable word as well. So there's some of the ethical issues that are in there, because we're not just talking about this drug which is a panacea to everyone. We're looking at something which is highly targeted, and which has to be undertaken. Any new technology, for example, should be socialised. So it needs to be uptaken in society, and there are some really key players and stakeholders in there, including physicians. I think the clinicians themselves are really an important part of that process, because they're the ones dealing with patients, they're the ones dealing with human beings. So at the moment the cost has risen because of that, but this is always the case when you have a new technology emerging. The upshot of it should be that the cost should be dramatically reduced over time, because what we're starting to see is large-scale clinical trials. For example, if you look at a phase 3 clinical trial, which is when you're getting a drug closer to market, you're seeing trials of, say, 3,000 patients in there over, say, 6-12 months. That's a really expensive undertaking. That can be $100 million, for example. What we're looking at, if we're seeing smaller trials, more targeting, more precision in there, over time we are going to see much dramatically reduced costs. Now, those N of 1 trials, obviously you need many of them, but that's also going to prove up the efficacy and the safety of those drugs. Safety is always a number one concern there for society. I think policy also is quite important, and in Australia in particular, I think we're really looking for policy leadership across the entire field of biotechnology, but most specifically, as we're talking about, in genomics. And that's been a real problem in this country. So we're not really seeing policy leadership at a national level as yet, and that's been a problem for our regulatory environment, keeping pace with the leading ones in the world, which is particularly the FDA in the US and the EMA in Europe. So resourcing is a really important part of that process for our regulatory framework to keep pace with the technology. And that's one of the biggest problems in this country currently. I think the US is always the lead. It's always regarded as a gold standard. And one of the reasons for that is that, there's a great deal of monitoring undertaken by the Food and Drug Administration in the US. They're quite well resourced, and where that we see these kind of emerging technologies moving through, they're quite proactive about, rethinking regulation, being quite agile with the regulation, and throwing money, literally throwing resources at the FDA. And the FDA has dramatically changed its own regulatory processes, where you see, with these types of pharmacogenomic developments, far more, not just more common, but more frequent meetings between the FDA and drug developers themselves. So you might have seen, say meetings, say once a month or once each 2 months. Generally we're seeing for many of these, which are going through that process, weekly meetings with senior people in the FDA who are giving extensive guidance as the developers progress through their pipeline. So totally different way of doing things we've seen emerging in the last 5 years, and that has had a really positive impact on the development process. But then we always have all these other issues around the pricing of drugs, the ethics of the trials and things like that. In this country, that's a challenge, but it may, some of the work that we're doing is looking at, should the federal government put a large amount of funding into the Therapeutic Goods Administration, or really, in a way, is it better for it to just sit back and wait for the developments to occur in Europe and in the US, and then to, just align policy and regulatory framework once they've settled down into a normal fashion? So there's nothing in a way wrong with that, but we're not involved then in the intellectual development, in the trial and error. So I think that doesn't help us in staying at the forefront of science and of the impacts of that science.